During the first years of the 1000s, England was being battered almost annually by vicious Viking raids, led primarily by Sweyn, King of the Danes, and his son Cnut. In 991, the English had suffered a bruising defeat at the Battle of Maldon at the hands of Olaf Tryggvason, another Viking chieftain, and the English king Ethelred was forced to pay a huge geld in return for peace. Tasting blood, the raiders became bolder, until by 1006 the entirety of Wessex was harried, prompting an unprecedented payoff of around £36,000 of silver. By 1008, the English king proactively attempted to construct a fleet of his own to catch the Vikings at sea. This impressive force was gathered at Sandwich and placed under the command of two men. The first man would go down as one of the great villains of English history, Adric, Ealdorman of Mercia, known better as Striona or the Grasper. Adric gained the favour of King Ethelred by murdering his rival Elfhelm, Ealdorman of York. Adric would go on to betray his lord, joining the Vikings before switching sides a couple more times, before meeting a grisly end at the hands of King Cnut. The second man is particularly relevant here as the father of Godwin, and, by extension, the grandfather of King Harold Godwinson. Wulfnoth killed was a Sussex thane of middling rank, possibly the same man who witnessed several diplomas of King Ethelred between 986 and 1005. His position near the bottom of recorded names on these documents reveals him as a relatively minor noble, his presence at court likely being infrequent at best. What is important about him is that he likely supplied many ships and seamen for the royal fleet, hence his command. Wulfnoth likely had personal reasons to head up the fleet too, driven by a lust for vengeance against the Danes and their savage forays into Sussex during 994, 998 and 1006. Alas, however, the Godwin family's first appearance into the clear light of history was blighted by circumstances. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Wulfnoth was accused of disloyalty by Adric's brother, prompting the latter to take 20 ships and ravage the south coast himself. Brittrick took the remaining 80 ships in pursuit, but was caught up in a violent storm, his fleet being destroyed at sea or run aground. The remaining vessels, beached, were sitting ducks for Wulfnoth, who took his vengeance by burning the remaining ships. What ships and seamen remained to Ethelred at Sandwich quickly deserted, leaving the way open for yet another Viking invasion, under a certain Thorkel the Tall. Not a great start for the Godwin heritage, however the next generation would prove formidable indeed, completely turning the family fortunes around from almost nothing. Wulfnoth fled indefinitely, perhaps hoping to avoid the fate of men like Elfhelm, the aforementioned unfortunate Ealdorman of York. We know that the family lands at Compton were confiscated, as in 1014 they were restored to his son Godwin, which likely means that Wulfnoth by this stage was dead. Godwin's rise seems to have gone well, as he was a valued enough member of the Atheling Ethelstan's entourage to feature in his will. In 1014, Ethelstan, eldest son and heir of the inept King Ethelred the Unready, died, and so if Godwin wanted to continue his rise, he had to seek patronage elsewhere. Luckily, there was another man who made this easy, Ethelstan's younger brother, known better to history as Edmund Ironside. Edmund was very close to his brother, both in terms of love and politically, with Ethelstan bequeathing lands, treasure, and a valuable sword, which once belonged to Offa, iconic King of Mercia. The brothers effectively formed a loyal opposition to their father and the political intrigues at court, thus making it easy for Godwin to transfer his allegiance. Ethelstan's will is interesting in another way, given he gave nothing to his half-brothers, Edward and Alfred, two men who would feature prominently in Godwin's life and affect even the fortunes of his son, Harold. Men such as Sigfurth, Morcar and Thurbrand, leading thanes of the Danelaw, with the first two related to the murdered Elfhelm of York, were also allies of Aethelstan mentioned in his will, and then Edmund, meaning the Aethelings, were most likely forming a nexus around which disaffected Englishmen could rally outside of their father's party. Sigfurth and Morcar were soon murdered by Adric, King Ethelred's enforcer, in 1015, with Edmund Ironside moving decisively to seize Sigfurth's widow, marry her in defiance of his father, and thus claim her lands, effectively rebelling against Ethelred, who was already ill at this point. Edmund became king on the death of his father, and Godwin likely participated in Edmund Ironside's raids into Adric Stryona's Mercian lands in the year of 1016, Striona having switched sides to Cnut, the Danish pretender. Unfortunately for Godwin, he ultimately backed the wrong horse, possibly fighting alongside his king, Edmund, at the Battle of Ashington, which saw Edmund betrayed by Striona for the last time, and Cnut's Danes drive the English from the field. Edmund was forced to cede all of England, bar Wessex, but eventually succumbed to his wounds later that year, thus leaving Cnut the undisputed master of all of England by the end of 1016. And that should have been that for Godwin and his family. Cnut effectively purged all of the senior English nobles in the period 1016 to 20, including the treacherous Adric Striona, who was dispatched in 1017, possibly by the axe of Eric of Lade himself, Cnut's new Earl of Northumbria. Remarkably, however, Godwin was not only not among these, but appeared to flourish under the new regime. In 1018, his name appears on Cnut's diplomas, and by the early 1020s tops them, replacing men such as Thorkel the Tall and Eric of Lade, Cnut's Scandinavian lieutenants. This at first appears surprising that the Danish king Cnut would keep an Englishman, a man of the defeated class, by his side. However, the later Encomium Mi Regini shed some light on why Godwin survived, stating that Cnut loved those whom he had heard to have fought previously for Edmund faithfully, without deceit, and hated those whom he knew to have been deceitful, and to have hesitated between the two sides. It appears then that Godwin's loyal nature shone through, and, indeed, Godwin would prove steadfast in his faith towards Cnut, even beyond his grave. By 1018 he was Earl of part of Wessex, promotion to be sure from his father's rank of Thane. Godwin proved his loyalty further by fighting directly for Cnut in his campaigns in Denmark in 1019 and then in 1022 to 23. 1020 was a pivotal year for the family. As Godwin's star rose that bit further, his authority extended to all of Wessex, incorporating its western shires. It was also around this time that Godwin was given Gwythyr, Cnut's sister-in-law, as his wife. Gwythyr was more than a reward, but a significant gesture on the king's part. Gwythyr was the sister of Ulf, the man Cnut made Jarl of all of Denmark, effectively ruler on his behalf. Ulf also happened to be married to Cnut's sister, their son, Cnut's nephew Sweyn, eventually succeeding to the Danish throne. The marriage, then, was just as much a political event as a reward, Cnut tying his English lieutenant closer to him and his circle of Scandinavian earls. By 1023 then, Godwin held a unique position in England, as an Englishman tightly bound by relation to Cnut, holding one of the highest offices in the land. Cnut's faith in Godwin is further evidenced in the latter's rapid rise to the top of Cnut's diplomas from about this time till the king's death. Godwin's large debt to Cnut is mirrored in the names he gave to his children. Sweyn, the name of Cnut's own father, was Godwin's firstborn, with Harold, the future Earl and King, being the name of Cnut's own grandfather, and Tostig, whose name was probably in honour of a renowned captain who had served Cnut. Gurth too had a Danish name, though it seems unconnected with his father's lord. Finally too, Gunhild, Godwin's daughter, was likely named after Cnut's own daughter. Godwin's younger sons, Leofwine and Wulfnoth, were English named, as was the future Queen Edith and his other daughters. By the end of Cnut's reign, Godwin was first amongst the great earls in prestige, the other men being Leofric, who succeeded his father Leofwine as Earl of Mercia, and Siward, Earl of Northumbria and of Danish origin. These men ruled large swathes of the kingdom under Cnut, and had a great deal of personal authority, given Cnut ruled a much larger North Sea empire. This stable period of growth, however, came to a stark end on November 12, 1035. Despite the existence of King Ethelred's sons, Edward and Alfred, who had lived all these years in exile in Normandy, Godwin threw his support behind Cnut's preferred successor, Harthacnut, the son of Queen Emma and Cnut. However, Harthacnut was not in England to press his claim, serving instead as his father's regent in Denmark. Another son, Harthacnut's half-brother Harold, was present and wasted no time pushing his own claim to the throne. Harold was not Emma's son, but the child of Cnut's earlier marriage to Elfgifu of Northampton. Earl Leofric, as well as many of Harold's relatives in the Midlands, elected him as king at the Witan held at Oxford. However, Godwin, to his credit, publicly threw his support behind the absent Harthacnut and his mother Emma. This decision may have been politically driven, given that Harthacnut had no real ties to England, unlike his half-brother Harold, whose mother's relatives supported him, could potentially provide an alternative native support. King Harold, then, would certainly be less dependent on Godwin, thus threatening his great power. Unfortunately, this position proved untenable, as Harthacnut failed to appear to support his claim. Emma's son by Cnut had problems of his own in Denmark, not daring to leave as his rival King Magnus of Norway threatened his position. Godwin was in danger of being on the wrong side of history. Harold, for his part, needed to consolidate his own position, and gaining allies south of the Thames would do this. Despite his unblemished record of loyalty, Godwin thus came to some form of accommodation with Harold. This is understandable, given that the great Earl had much more to lose now than he had as a relatively unknown thane back in his younger days. Harold seized much of Cnut's royal treasure from Queen Emma at Winchester, which pressed the matter further. It was also at this point that Emma called for her sons by King Ethelred to return, which they duly did. The elder of the two did make landfall near Southampton, but was repulsed, forced back to sea by local opposition. His younger brother Alfred was not so fortunate, and what happened next would blot the careers of both Godwin and later his son Harold. Alfred Atheling sailed from Wissant to Dover with the intention of moving on London, accompanied by only a small retinue. Alfred, almost all the sources agree, was arrested at Guildford, and his men killed or dispersed. While it is unlikely that Godwin did any harm to Alfred himself, he did hand over the Atheling to Harold, perhaps wishing to curry favour with the man most likely to come out on top as King of England. Mercy was not afforded to the young prince, with Harold blinding him at Ely before leaving him there to eventually die. It was this event that would irreparably tarnish Godwin's later relationship with King Edward, yet for now it helped to mend the initially rocky start to his relationship with King Harold, as in 1037 the latter was confirmed as king everywhere, with Godwin too confirmed in his earldom. Godwin's erstwhile ally, Queen Emma, was forced into exile in Bruges. Things should have been sewn up nicely, however, what had been a mild headache would explode into a skull-bursting migraine for Godwin and his family, as matters were complicated once more. In 1039, Harthacnut finally felt secure in setting sail from Denmark, coming to an arrangement with Magnus of Norway. Godwin would now soon find himself in between two warring sons of his former master Cnut. He was perhaps relieved, if nervous, when Harold, just 5 years into his reign, died in the summer of 1040, leaving Harthacnut to take control of England. That the new king was angry was an understatement, as one of his first acts was to have his half-brother's corpse dug up from its grave in Westminster and thrown unceremoniously into a nearby fen. Harthacnut also punished England's leading men, presumably Godwin included, by levying a large tax to pay off his invasion fleet. This time, Godwin faced accusations from some of his peers that he was more involved in Alfred's death than first appeared, in response to which he swore a solemn oath that he had no role in Alfred's blinding. Godwin tried to further grease the path to reconciliation by gifting the latest king a magnificent ship, which seems to have done much to assuage Harthacnut's wrath. Further proof of Godwin's refound faith would be needed, however. In 1041, Godwin was ordered, along with the other earls, to ravage Worcester and its shire in revenge for its killing of 2 royal housecarls who had been murdered for collecting the fleet tax. These actions, however, proved destabilizing to Harthacnut's tenuous hold over his kingdom, which probably prompted his call, locally influenced by his mother, Queen Emma, for Edward, his half-brother, to return to England. Edward was invited to share rule of England with him, though as it turns out, Cnut's last son died soon after, on 8th of June 1042, leaving Edward, son of King Ethelred and Emma, the last man standing to succeed to the English throne. For Godwin, this was both a blessing and a curse. Edward was a king without ties to England, having lived the last 25 years in Normandy with his mother's relatives. However, there was also the matter of Alfred and Godwin's involvement, be it indirectly, in his grisly death. Godwin weathered this by placing himself front and centre, calling for Edward's succession. He also tried the same trick he had performed with Edward's half-brother just months before, offering him a great ship, as fine as that offered to Harthacnut. In truth, Godwin was in effect more important to Edward than vice versa, with the latter wholly dependent on the goodwill of all the great earls, Godwin in particular. Godwin thus secured his own power and that of his family. In return for Godwin's support, King Edward not only confirmed Godwin in his seat of Wessex, controlling Edward's ancestral lands, but he also raised Godwin's sons, Sweyn and Harold, to earldoms, as well as Bjorn, Godwin's nephew. The coup de grace, however, was the marriage of Godwin's daughter, Edith, to King Edward on 23rd of January 1045. Harold, Godwin's second son, was in his early 20s and was made Earl of East Anglia, witnessing several royal diplomas between 1044 and 45, with Godwin's second-born being named Dux or Earl in these from 1045 onwards. Everything may have seemed peachy for the Godwins. They effectively monopolised political power in the south of England, and yet it would be one of their own who would set the stage for family disunity. In 1046, Sweyn, Godwin's eldest son, brazenly abducted the abbess of Leominster, another Edith, his intention perhaps to marry her and claim her lands, as abbesses were often noble women. The move was widely condemned, and he was forced to eventually release her, and went into exile, to the dismay of his father and to the enrichment of his cousin and brother. With Sweyn gone, Godwin's son Harold gained a share of his brother's forfeited lands, as did Bjorn, maybe as a consolation for Godwin. This incident would be the first of a series of events that would pry apart the fragile alliance between king and earl. Edward, it seems, was annoyed by Godwin's interference with royal justice, even given the consensus of condemnation of his eldest son. Another sensitive issue was Queen Edith and her childlessness. The primary role of a queen was to provide the kingdom with an heir and successor, yet no male heir was forthcoming. This put an added stress on relations, given Edward knew all too well Godwin and his family would never allow an annulment to his marriage, especially given his father-in-law could still harbour hopes that a Godwin grandson would inherit the English throne. Another dispute arose in 1047, with Godwin advocating that the king assist Sweyn, his wife's nephew and king in Denmark, against Magnus of Norway. Leofric, Earl of Mercia, opposed this, and Edward sided with him, leaving Sweyn to his fate. The latter indeed temporarily lost his kingdom to the anger of Godwin, who wanted to render him English assistance. Relations worsened and exposed cracks in Godwin family unity when in 1049 Sweyn appeared back in England. Earl Sweyn's exile in Denmark had gone badly, and even the Vikings had kicked him out, prompting his return. Edward merely confirmed his sentence of exile, yet Sweyn, perhaps sensing a way back, apparently persuaded his cousin Bjorn to speak to the king on his behalf. The two rode together to Bosom, and then something went terribly wrong. Sweyn attacked, bound, and took his cousin on board his ship before murdering him in cold blood. For this act, his disgusted men branded him a Neefing, or without honour, and mostly deserted him. For King Edward and most of the kingdom, this was an open and shut case. Sweyn was beyond the pale and forced to flee into exile in Flanders. Earl Harold sided firmly with the king and the majority, even against his father. Amazingly, despite all this, however, Godwin still lobbied for his firstborn's return. He must have pushed the king hard. Harold, for his part, was now less opposed to his disgraced brother's return, given that Bjorn's vacated lands could now accommodate him, with little to no loss to him. Edward was persuaded, reluctantly, to allow Sweyn's return, though the latter agreed to perform a penance by making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which he did in 1052. Sweyn thus returned to England in 1050, blighting the name of the family, and by his presence increasing tensions with the king, given that Edward had created a small earldom for his own nephew Ralph in Hertfordshire, which was now disputed with Godwin's murderous son. All of these pressures on the relationship between Edward and Godwin pushed the king closer to those intimates he had brought with him from Normandy. The greatest of these was no doubt Robert of Jumieges, who Edward had made Bishop of London in 1044. Robert almost certainly shared his master's disgust and disapproval of Sweyn's actions, and had swiftly emerged as the principal anti-Godwin figure at court. The trigger for the political crisis that engulfed England in 1051-52 and had Robert near its centre began with the death of Ecgtheow, Archbishop of Canterbury, in October 1050, which was followed soon after by the Archbishop of York in January 1051. For Edward, this was perhaps too tempting an opportunity to miss, to continue to turn the tables on his hated rival. Canterbury and York were the premier episcopal seats in his kingdom, both highly desirable and lucrative. Godwin, for his part, fully backed the monks of Canterbury itself, who wanted Elric, Godwin's relative, as archbishop. Edward, of course, was having none of this, and nominated his own man, Robert, Bishop of London, to the archbishopric. Not only this, but he also placed his own men in other key positions, including another royal favourite at York. For Robert, such an elevation was a licence to go for the political jugular, so to speak. He denounced Godwin, arguing he had seized church lands, properly due to his see. The latter tolerated the insult, likely wishing to see his exiled son Sweyn fully restored to favour. However, the archbishop was not finished, even hinting that the overmighty Earl planned to kill the king, just as he had allegedly killed his brother Alfred in 1036. In early 1051, Archbishop Robert left England for Rome, perhaps annoyed at Edward's alarm at his very vocal condemnation of his rival, and also at Edward's decision to overlook Robert's own candidate for the See of London he had just vacated in favour of a certain Spearhavoc. Upon returning with his pallium in June of 1051, Robert went so far as to declare he no longer recognised Spearhavoc as Bishop of London, somehow convincing the Pope of this. Despite this brazen defiance of his patron, however, it was clear Robert was a single piece in a larger political game to undermine Godwin. Edward's court was cosmopolitan, including Bretons, Flemings, Germans, Lotharingians, and even other Frenchmen. Edward also promoted his own nephew Ralph to an earldom on the Welsh marches in 1047, which seems to be an overt threat to Sweyn Godwinson's jurisdiction. What's more, Edward also gave the guardianship of the harbour at Bosham to Osbern, the brother of William Fitz-Osbern, the right-hand man of Duke William of Normandy. Matters finally came to a head in the crisis of 1051, an event that would have a profound and deadly effect on the life of Godwin and even the future King Harold Godwinson. Edward managed to force the Godwin family's exile from England, following Godwin's refusal to punish Dover for its defence against an attack by Edward's brother-in-law, Eustace of Boulogne. Eustace had been invited to visit as King Edward's brother-in-law, and heading back home through Dover had roughly handled the men there. Eustace's intentions were perhaps clear, as he and his men were armoured as they entered, which implies a readiness for trouble. Politically, this trap theory also makes sense, as Eustace had a strong motivation to get his royal brother-in-law on side, since Normandy and Flanders, both on his borders, had recently concluded an alliance that threatened him. Whether intentional or not, Edward had an excuse to take down the stifling Godwin and his family. Whether feigned or not, the king expressed anger at the treatment of his relative by the men of Dover, and as it lay clearly in Godwin's territory, he demanded his greatest earl punish it. For Godwin, horrible memories of the harrying of Worcester probably resurfaced, and with the choice of bloody compliance or rebellion, he chose the latter. The stage was set for a clash at Gloucester on September 8th of 1051. Godwin set about rallying his loyal men and supporters in his own earldom, with both his sons, Earls Sweyn and Harold, doing likewise. Edward too leveraged his own considerable support. This certainly included Archbishop Robert, as well as other clerics, and, of course, Earl Ralph, and even Eustace, who by this point still hadn't left England. Most notable among his supporters, and what ultimately tipped the balance, was the support of the other great earls, Leofric and Siward, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, respectively. Godwin, however, initially held the upper hand by arriving near Gloucester early with an armed force around September 1st. Godwin used this opportunity to attempt to persuade the startled king that he was innocent of Alfred's death, and that all he wanted was for Eustace and his band of men to stand trial for their treatment of the men of Dover. However, if Godwin had wanted to force the king's hand through brute strength, he severely miscalculated. Edward instead stalled the earl and rallied his own support, portraying the situation as an earl rebelling against his lord and refusing a legal order. For whatever reason, Siward and Leofric swallowed this and moved south with their own armed contingents. Remarkably though, despite hotter heads probably pushing both men to strike the first blow, neither side actually wanted a civil war. Godwin did not attack Edward in the interim, even when the king refused his demands, and when the king gained the upper hand, he did not unleash his supporters on the earl. That Godwin was over a barrel was obvious at this point. Hostages were demanded, and the Godwin camp gave up Wulfnoth, the earl's youngest son, and Hakon, the son of Earl Sweyn and Godwin's grandson. No mention is made of any hostages given from the king's side, perhaps reflecting the power imbalance. On 21st of September, the two sides once more converged on London, With delay in negotiations working to Edward's advantage, the northern earls were now firmly behind him and had gathered their full forces, whereas Godwin's following only dwindled, given that, loyal as most were, they were not willing to take up arms against their lawful king. The king's confidence growing by the hour, he summarily declared the murderous Earl Sweyn an outlaw, before commanding that both Godwin and his second-born, Harold, appear before the council. Godwin, perhaps nervous of betrayal, asked for assurances from the king of safe conduct, but these were starkly refused. Now Godwin must have known that he was beaten, and he began arrangements for his exile. King Edward pushed his advantage further by declaring both Godwin, Harold, and his entire family as outlaws in early October. Godwin, along with his wife Gwythyr, his sons Sweyn, Tostig, and Gurth, boarded ship at Bosom and sailed into what must have seemed the end of his spectacular rise, arriving at Flanders to a warm welcome, as Tostig had recently married Judith, the sister of the count there. With them went a vast baggage of treasure. Godwin's son, Earl Harold, however, along with his brother Leofwine, headed to Bristol, shaking off the pursuit of Eldred, Bishop of Worcester, and made it to a ship which had originally been prepared for the likely exile of his brother Sweyn. Sailing from the River Avon, the brothers headed for Ireland. With his rivals safely banished, King Edward, at the prompting of Robert, divorced Edith, daughter of Godwin, to fully sever his links with the family. Edith was in addition banished from court, shut up in the care of the Abbess of Wilton. 1051 must have seemed to King Edward his golden year, the true start of his own personal power. Now he could untangle himself from the barren Queen Edith and seek a new wife to sire an heir, not of the blood of Godwin, his hated rival. Interestingly, and in what, if true, must have had huge implications for the future King Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D states that it was at this time that King Edward's relative, William, the young Duke of Normandy, visited England, though it disappointingly does not state for what reason. Later Norman sources see this as the smoking gun of Edward's designation of Duke William as his heir. However, there are problems with this, not least the fact that Edward was perfectly well aware that the succession was not contingent on the wishes of the incumbent king alone, but was ultimately the decision of the Witan, or council of leading nobles of the kingdom. Edward simply had no authority to designate anyone as king after his time. Another problem is that this story is inconsistent with how Edward acts much later, his desire to track down a great-nephew from the line of Edmund Ironside to designate as his preference, not squaring with a Norman succession. What is probably true is the visit of Robert of Jumieges, Archbishop of Canterbury, or if not during this period, immediately after, as Robert fled England. Norman sources William of Poitiers and William of Jumieges state that Robert was sent to Normandy to confirm Edward's designation of William as his heir. What is certain is that by 1064, Duke William had both of the 1051 Godwinson hostages in his possession. In fact, the wretched Wulfnoth, youngest son of Godwin, would remain in Norman captivity for most of his life, only being briefly released on the orders of the dying conqueror, only to be cruelly rearrested and imprisoned by his son and successor, King William Rufus. These hostages were apparently collateral for William's succession, though it is more likely, as we shall see, that William's possession of Godwin's relatives has a more mundane explanation. Meanwhile in Ireland, the exiled Earl Harold gathered support, men and material with a mind to supporting his father's bid for reinstatement. The King of Leinster moved at this time to fully control the Dublin area by expelling the incumbent Norse-Irish king, and may even have been assisted in this by Harold himself. Harold may have prompted further support through trading concessions with major English ports, so that in time he had built up substantial support. Godwin, around this time, was also not idle, making similar preparations in Flanders and perhaps applying some much needed cold calculation to his position. It was at this time that he decided to remove his largest obstacle to reinstatement, his eldest son Sweyn, who he sent on pilgrimage. The Godwin family was gathering a large fleet to assist their return, but King Edward was not merely willing to sit by and do nothing, gathering his own royal fleet of around 40 ships, which he mustered at Sandwich under the control of his nephew Earl Ralph and Earl Oda. Ralph and Oda had no doubt gained from Godwin's exile, but they proved inexperienced naval commanders and unable to pin down the aging ex-earl. In the summer of 1052, he probed the south coast, briefly occupying Pevensey and then later the Isle of Wight. It was here that Godwin recalled Harold from Dublin and then began harrying his own former lands, perhaps punishing those men who had deserted him during negotiations in 1051. Harold responded by sailing up the Severn with 9 ships and ravaged the Porlock area. Porlock was in Earl Oda's territory, and Harold was met by a local force of men, and yet defeated them in his first military action. In the minor battle, he killed around 30 Thanes and some others, gaining a large amount of booty before making his way towards the Isle of Wight. The large Godwin fleet snaked its way east along the Channel coast, picking up further support in Sussex and Kent, while, in an inversion of events a year previous, King Edward's pleas for armed support fell largely on deaf ears, with no movement from the great earls Leofric or Siward. This withdrawal of support could probably be explained as a political safeguarding of their own power. During the negotiations of 1051, it is probable that Leofric and Siward thought that some kind of compromise would be reached, and even that they would benefit from a complete Godwin exile. In any case, minds were sharpened as the implications of the Godwin's family exile became clear. If King Edward could oust the greatest family in the land, then what prevented him from doing the same to these other great men? By September of 1052, events replayed themselves once again, with Godwin negotiating directly with the people of London, and then sailing up the Thames to await the king's response. As previously, the envoy appointed was Stigand, Bishop of Winchester, who both sides apparently trusted. Initial negotiations clearly went well, as it prompted the flight of one of Edward's principal supporters during 1051, his Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges. His fellow Norman bishops Ulf and William at his tail, it is likely that the trio dragged the 1051 Godwinson hostages, Wulfnoth and Hakon, with them as they fled. Indeed, the chronicle appears to mildly support this, recording the deaths of some royal thanes at the east gate of London, men who perhaps tried to prevent this breach of royal trust, and yet failed. On 15th of September, Godwin's victory was sealed, this time in the presence of the other great earls, Siward and Leofric. Bishop Stigand had done much of the legwork already, with Godwin again swearing an oath that he had no direct involvement in Alfred's death. Godwin was duly restored to all his lands and offices, as was his son Harold, though one notable exception was Sweyn. Turning the tables on Edward's Norman supporters, Archbishop Robert, along with Ulf, Bishop of Worcester, were deemed banished, as were Frenchmen resident in Hertfordshire, who, though they had initially fled to their castles once word of Godwin's return came to them, ultimately made their way north to Scotland. Meanwhile, deposed Archbishop Robert likely did everything he could to convince William back in Normandy that he was Edward's preferred heir. He also handed over his valuable hostages as a gift to William to prove that King Edward favoured him. Robert, in addition, complained loudly to the Pope about his own removal, probably emphasised Stigand's pluralism, which resulted in successive popes condemning Stigand, and also to the general lowering of the reputation of the English Church up to 1066. For King Edward, his fortunes had plummeted to new depths. Not only was he back where he started, Godwin was restored, and the vile swain would soon return. He was even worse off, as he was now bereft of his Norman, French supporters. However, all was not lost. On September 29, 1052, Sweyn died near Constantinople on his way back to England. His father, the family patriarch, would soon follow to Edward's delight. Earl Harold perhaps quietly celebrated his older brother's demise, as his father's unconditional support would likely have left him to play second in command to the whims of a savage and possibly crazy elder brother as Earl of Wessex. Harold would not have long to wait as Godwin's heir. Godwin collapsed on Easter Monday of 1053 at a feast with King Edward himself. He lingered on for 3 days, but finally expired on April 15th. Though the phrase is often overused, this really was the end of an era. Godwin was buried in the Old Minster in Winchester. The man who had done more than any other to propel his son to the kingship died, and Harold was quickly recognised by Edward as his successor to the earldom of Wessex. So that concludes this in-depth biography, perhaps the greatest noble of 11th century England, the father of a queen and future king. But what do you think about the indomitable Earl Godwin? Was he an ambitious and overmighty vassal, intent on securing England for his own family, or was he simply a man of his time, doing what any other in his position would have done, and succeeding very well? Let us all know in the comments, and we shall see you next time.